Hello, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with Annie Gelfoyle, together we run Garden Masterclass. Welcome to our YouTube channel. We put here the recordings from the session we do every Thursday evening at 6 o'clock London time, a practice we started during the April 2020 lockdown as a way of reaching out to the global garden and landscape community. We hope you enjoy this recording, but also please do check out our website for all the amazing range of information-packed webinar and workshop recordings we have. Maybe consider joining us because members get access to our vast archive of free material as well as discounts on the webinar recordings. We've also recently started a podcast channel on Substack. So we do a weekly podcast and so that's a way of accessing a lot of our recorded material that you can listen to whilst you're digging or driving or watering or whatever else. So I very much hope you enjoy this recording and looking forward to keeping in contact. Now, we should introduce tonight's guest. But before I do that, I'm just going to do a bit of a sort of drum roll. I discovered the whole field of naturalistic planting in the mid-90s, got very enthusiastic about it, did what I could to promote it. I worked on some very interesting and continue to work on some very interesting projects. But of course, as one gets older, things change, younger people come along. And of course, it has been have given us all, I think, huge satisfaction and pride that what we were talking about very much in the mid-90s as quite a minority position is now almost become mainstream. But I sometimes wonder, where are the stars? Where are the younger people who are perhaps rising above the majority of practitioners and really doing interesting stuff or really effectively promoting or educating. So I'm delighted this evening to have somebody who I think is something of a rising star. Lena Hahn is German-Turkish but lives in France, works mostly in France. She's had a very varied career to date, and I think she'll have and I think there's a lot of other people who agree with me that Anna-Lena is somebody to watch, and both in terms of her design work, but also perhaps academically and theoretically as well. So, welcome, Anna-Lena.
Thank
Uh,
you, Noel. I'm flattered. I'm
um,
very happy to be here today and to have this chat with you.
yes,
Very curious where it's going to lead us.
yes. Okay, right. Where will it lead us? So, first of all, we always like to ask people, how did you get into gardens and landscapes and plants in the first place?
Well, to really go back to the beginning, I'm not going to say in my childhood garden because there were experiences, but they were actually not so strong for me. I think my beginnings were in a small restaurant in Tel Aviv where I worked when I was 22, 23.
Yes.
Um, I actually led the restaurant for around 2 years, and I was the youngest of the team, so that in itself was a very strong experience. But
Mm-hmm.
another strong experience was that it was a completely plant-based restaurant, and a lot of plants were integrated for their healing effects. And that was my first exposure to plants growing in a certain landscape and the qualities of these plants and the landscape having magic effects. And I think that awakened some curiosity in me, both
Good. Mm-hmm.
taste as a sensation, but also how are plants integrated into our life? And that brought me actually into gardening.
Oh, right, right. I knew you'd run a vegan restaurant in Tel Aviv, but I didn't realize that was your first involvement with plants. Because what was your first degree?
Oh my God, I really did something different. I did philosophy, politics, and economics. So a completely broad degree that trains you in learning how to think and to orient yourself in fields. But it was long after, it was a bit after that I actually discovered that plants and landscape were my actual fascination.
Yes, yes. So, and then you've worked on some very interesting projects that do integrate landscape and food, eating the landscape, and those have been in France, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. And actually that practice was born at the same time as I began gardening and designing.
Mm,
And maybe I could say, maybe I can tell a concrete experience that marked me in the beginning. It was around a sown prairie. So I was sowing a prairie in the city that I was living in.
mm.
And right before the moment that the prairie would like go up into bloom, the green space management actually cut it down accidentally because they thought it was all weeds.
Yes, yes. I think a lot of us have had that experience at some time or other.
Exactly. And it really made me think. It really stayed with me, this experience. And I thought, actually, to make changes in design,
Mm,
we also need to work with people's perception of how they actually see and, like, so to say, to break through the green wall, that not
mm,
everything that is green is the same, but that actually the more we see and the more we experience plants, the more we know how to accompany them. And
mm,
taste is a very strong experience of plants. So I often started to work with a colleague of mine. We worked together as Atelier Zatar. We worked with groups of gardeners, green space agents, students, and other groups. And
mm,
we did walks in the landscape, let them taste plants, cooked with the plants as another way into getting to know plants that you then later use maybe in a garden or in a design.
mm, mm, mm. Indeed, and you sent in some rather wonderful images, which we'll see later on that theme. Um, so, what in terms of your formal study of landscape, where did you study?
I studied in the UK, in England, at Schumacher College, which is a college that is specialized in ecology and design. This
Mm,
is where a major part of my landscape perception work,
mm,
but
mm,
also my scientific understanding of ecology comes from.
mm,
And
mm,
then I went on to do a PhD actually, and the PhD was situated between landscape architecture and human geography. So at
mm,
times, how to create, design, and build landscapes, but also how do people perceive them. And it was in that PhD that I really, I think, got a lot of skill in bridging between scientific ecology, which is kind of a world apart and a language apart,
mm,
design and horticulture.
mm, mm. So, could you tell us about the places where you conducted your research?
Yes, I actually went back to my hometown, which is Recklinghausen in the Ruhr in Germany. And the Ruhr is very known for being a strongly industrialized area. It's a coal mining area and a steel area. And actually, I already had this landscape curiosity, and then during one of my trips home, I kind of thought, but is this also a landscape? Like, can a scarred landscape, such as a coal mining and steel landscape, what kind of landscape is that, and how does one design with such a landscape? So I began conducting my research at Landscape Park Duisburg Nord,
Mm.
which is worldwide known, but I grew up next to it without knowing about it. So in a way, it was a
Oh,
home
right.
with another angle. And
Mm,
I
mm,
accompanied the gardeners and the directors there in how they manage the spontaneous plant communities that are coming up on that post-industrial ground.
mm,
And I worked at Hermannshof together with Kassian Schmidt to understand more about the guidance and the dynamic maintenance of plant communities. I
mm,
worked in Cleveland in a project together with the University of Michigan and Professor Joan Nassauer
mm,
on
mm.
how to integrate biodiverse gardens into city neighborhoods in
Yes.
quite popular neighborhoods. And then I also worked on a former clay quarry in the south of France. So yeah, each of these localities had a different topic attached, but all of them shared a commonality, namely how to accompany and design with dynamic plant communities, especially
Mm,
in urban and post-industrial contexts.
mm, mm, mm. Could you tell us a bit more about Joan Nassau, who's quite a well-known name, and I think has had some quite important things to say.
Yeah, I really admire Joan's work. I think Joan has done incredible work at the intersection of landscape perception, ecology, and design.
Mm,
Um, and I think one thing that I really learned from Joan is that an aesthetics is always relative to the life context and to the locality of a community. And for
mm,
example, as I was so dislocated working on this design project in Cleveland, it's very easy to come into a project as a designer and to think, I need to bring an aesthetics here and I need to bring something beautiful. And I think what I learned from her is that more often as designers, we should have the modesty to say, how do people actually express their sense of beauty here and their likings? And how, as designers, can we take more cues from such local vernacular aesthetics, pick them up and enhance them. And yeah, that is something that I admired Joan's way of seeing for. And she calls these ways of expressing local aesthetics cues to care. So how do
Mm,
people express care in a landscape?
mm. Because I think she would argue that landscapes need to be seen as being cared for, because if they're not cared for, people don't have any respect for them. They don't get any political support. I mean, it's a very important message, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. And I think Joan's work is so important as we now move into a phase where biodiverse and or highly diverse plantings are actually desired
Mm,
politically. And I
mm,
think Joan's work actually gives us the resources to say, yeah, but how can we implement such plantings in public space without
mm,
overwhelming people's, let's say, aesthetic capacities of finding something beautiful? And I think to simply reason and to say, yeah, but it's good for biodiversity is not enough. So I
mm.
think Joan does very interesting work on helping us to, yeah, to make such plantings acceptable and how to have design techniques like classic is messy ecosystems and then to surround them with very straight edges as
Mm,
one
mm.
way of showing here, this is a cared for space.
And the messy bit is messy because it's meant to be.
Yeah, exactly. Messy ecosystems and orderly frames. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something. This is something in my lifetime, and I'm going to reference to sort of my age. Things have changed so much that so many of us were brought up with any kind of design landscape as being seen as tidy, and of course, in the United States, fearsomely mown. And we have seen a lot of changes, but those changes, I think, have been very uneven and relate a lot to different communities and perhaps to levels of education and social class. Um, yeah, I remember James Van James Van Sweden. I'm sure that's a name you know. I mean, he died, oh gosh, some 10 years ago now, I think, visiting a project I was doing in England and saying, "Oh, this is." Oh, the Americans they can never understand this. They can never read this. They simply won't do. But of course, we're now seeing um, Claudia West and um, uh, uh, his name escapes me.
Rainer?
Reiner, yes, doing with Fighter Studio, doing exactly what I was doing, and it being accepted, or at least by part of that demographic. But I would imagine that when you're in Cleveland, that that is not a part of the United States, perhaps that's necessarily very forward-looking in landscape terms. But I'm also aware that that this reaction to nature in design landscapes is actually really contested in the United States, and you still have these lawn ordinances, and it's got in the very sort of polarized cultural situation in the United States. Unfortunately, it seems to be um, that seems to be becoming part of the divide. Was that something you felt, or do you feel, or would you be more optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a very lawn-dominated aesthetics that I met there, which was unfamiliar for me. Um, I think an interesting point to bring up is that I think we are a bit in the age of ecology and nature at the moment, but there is very polarized and quite simplistic thinking going around
Mm,
about what that means. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that um, allowing other than human life, both in terms of plants and animals, means to do nothing and to let nature take its course.
mm,
And
mm.
that is then the flip side of complete control. I mean, I'm
Yes, yes,
France, and in France, that is very much that's a duality that shapes a lot of garden thinking here. I mean,
yes,
castle
yes,
gardens are basically an expression of domination, which is how
yes.
they their beauty. And then thinkers like, for example, Gilles Clément, who
Mm, mm,
yeah, who I also admire, but Gilles Clément basically takes the opposite and flips it and says we need to let things do their way. And I think both sides are a bit extreme, and I'm more interested in the middle ground where I think
mm.
Joan did a lot of work, or also Cassian
Yes.
Schmidt, and Jaugstetter,
Mm,
who say, well, how do we actually skillfully guide spontaneous and planted or seeded communities in a way that they make sense to us as human communities, but also
Yeah.
biodiversity. And I think that's a really interesting ground.
Mm, mm, mm. Yes, because a central part of your research was looking at how we should perhaps be dissolving this boundary between uh, design and the designer and management and
Mm.
management staff. And perhaps could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, it actually also links back to these initial experiences I had like years ago when I started to work in gardening and in design, and realizing that even really well conceived and designed projects can very easily fail if they're not taken on well through a skilled gardener team or management or yeah, basic caretaking of the planting. And I realized, and I found that quite absurd, that a huge part of the resources in the landscape design industry go into design, and only
Mm,
a tiny little part goes into teaching and equipping maintenance teams and
mm,
ensuring long-term development. And so I felt it was really important to actually shine light on the kind of work that is required to accompany plantings in the long term. Like, what kind of skills does it need to be a gardener in in a dynamic perennial planting? And how can we equip teams in cities to do that kind of work? And yeah, I really wanted to work on that shift from 80% goes into design and 20% goes into maintenance, to say, well, how can design become, no, how can maintenance become a form of design? Because it's actually a creative activity over years.
yes, so Cassian is just joining us. I need to let him in. Um, sorry. Um, Yeah, so but this is actually quite a challenge when you think of the low skill level and quite honestly low remuneration of landscape staff. There needs surely perhaps we need a whole new profession. I mean, people who combine the skills of horticulture and ecology, but above all have education, training, and better remuneration and conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a key to investigate what kind of training young people also at universities need to be able to do this long-term maintenance work. And I think, I mean, I said that I did research in the Ruhr around post-industrial landscapes, and during that time, I also realized that there's a real class split in the landscape industry, because people who studied and who have high education, they usually go into design positions or or yeah, or are garden directors, whereas people who are, so to say, blue collar workers, they're in quite low paid maintenance jobs, and the disconnect between them, these two spheres in the landscape world, is quite extreme.
Mm. Well, yes. Can you honestly see a situation where that might change? Or put it another way, is there anywhere where you can actually see or have you've seen this new approach developing? Because for many of us, I think it does seem incredibly idealistic.
Yes. I mean, I can tell you about experiments that I've done.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't tell you where it's already working,
Mm,
but I can tell you what I've been trying.
mm,
For example, right now I'm coming back from the Aubrac, which is a volcanic plateau in the center of France, and I've been working for a year with my colleague Tiziana and several groups of the territory on how to change their way of greening urban spaces, because they're
mm.
using mostly annuals that are exchanged every 6 weeks, which is highly, yeah, I mean,
Mad. Yes.
I'm not going to say anything more. So that's the state of the art, so to say,
Mm,
pansies and tulips. And so before even planting anything, we've already done 2 years of work with the green space management team, the town hall, groups of
mm,
students, the botanical garden, a local nursery. So we've built a whole ecosystem before even beginning to plant. And now,
mm,
after all this time, we have now planted a roundabout and a public garden in the city center. But even to come to the planting and to come to a place where there are local plants that are produced, perennial plants that are produced, the green space agents are formed in a way that they know how to accompany it. We're now
Mm-hmm.
also going to go back and form them as the planting develops to educate new groups of students that
Yeah.
will later become these agents in working with perennial plantings. So I feel like this groundwork of working with different groups of the profession is super, super important to then
Mm.
have a better transition between design and maintenance. So I feel
Yeah.
like one needs to do deeper work in a way than than just doing design.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
say.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier the name Gilles Clément, who is somebody that, in the English-speaking world we're just kind of vaguely aware of. It's been a crucial figure in French landscape, and you recently profiled him in the German magazine Gartenpraxis. How would you explain Gilles Clément uh, uh, um, to a non-French audience?
Hmm. Maybe I would tell a small anecdote that he told me while we were in his garden. Um, so when you arrive in his garden, he usually gives you a little tour, and at some point you come to a point from which you can see the house and the garden in like nearly all its aspects. And I remember standing there with him and saying, "Wow, you have a really beautiful but also atypical house." And then he said, "Yeah, it's quite atypical because the stones all have different sizes." And I said, and why is that? And he said, "Well, when I arrived here, the ground was actually very stony. So I started to dig out the stones. And then I thought, well, if I already have the stones, I could basically also build my house." And that's what I did for around 7 years.
Yes. Wow. Mm, mm,
And I
mm.
think even though it's an anecdote about his house, it says a lot about how he's gardening
Yeah.
with incredible patience for the materials and the plants that are locally present
Mm,
and
mm.
creatively shaping them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that impressed me a lot.
Mm, mm. So is he working mostly with native vegetation?
He's actually in France, he is one of the practitioners who's trying to make a point that native vegetation today is a bit of an absurd thing to say.
Mm,
He
mm,
speaks
mm.
about, in French, it's called brassage planétaire, so planetary brewing. And he
Yeah.
says, well, actually, with like goods and people traveling, plants have traveled so much that there is no such thing in Europe anymore as local vegetation. So I
Mm.
think he would rather say he works with spontaneous plants or plants
Yeah.
that arise in a given locality, no matter where they originate.
So in other words, he is embracing the concept of the novel ecosystem,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
which is something that I think that a lot of ecologists have found very, very difficult because of this dogmatic fixation on nature. But of course, spontaneous vegetation is essentially what, in a climate change world, and particularly in a urban world, we're going to have to work with. Um, and indeed, actually, in a few weeks' time, we're going to be interviewing one of the landscape architects who worked on the Warsaw Uprising Mound, which is entirely spontaneous, and for
Wonderful.
a
I'm
lot
gonna
of
come to that. I've heard interesting things about that from
yes,
Bettina.
yes, yes. No, it was an amazing pace. I mean, perhaps the middle of the winter wasn't the best time to be there, but no, a very interesting project, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of this embrace of and acceptance of and working with, in some cases, what might in other circumstances be regarded as invasive species.
But
But
then
if
I think what's interesting about Gilles Clément is that here, like, he's often interpreted as, so to say, a laissez-faire gardener. So somebody who does nothing and who just lets everything grow. And that's also not true because actually Gilles has a lot of skill in reading the life cycle of a plant. And
yes,
for
yes,
example, I'm missing the English term because I'm always thinking in French, but the berce de Caucase, Caucasian berce.
um, the life cycle.
Uh, Wait, I'm gonna look it up. Anyway, it's classed as a giant hogweed.
Oh,
Oh,
yes,
giant
yeah,
hogweed in France is classed as an invasive
yeah, yeah.
plant, and it burns because it makes the skin photosensible.
Yeah.
However, Gilles Clément has one in his garden, but he doesn't just let it there. He actually cuts the head of the plant right before it would seed. So he actually, I think he has a huge skill in understanding at which part of the life cycle of the plant does he need to intervene to make sure that it doesn't overly spread. And I think that's actually the skill of a real gardener to understand
Yes.
at which point do I intervene to
Mm,
stir things. So
mm.
I don't think that it's as simple as that, that Gilles says, well, let's just all let it grow. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. If you were organizing a sort of theoretically organizing a tour of France to see Gilles Clément projects, what would you recommend visiting?
Gilles Clément projects. I would definitely go to Saint-Nazaire. Saint-Nazaire
Yeah.
is between Nantes and the seaside, and
Mm,
there's a huge bunker left over from World War I, I believe. And on the rooftop of this bunker, I think there's also a photo in the slideshow
yeah.
that's going to come up. On the rooftop of the bunker, Gilles added 10 centimeter of very poor substrate,
Mm, mm.
planted plants that are resistant to the strong wind that comes from the sea and the
Yeah,
drought that
yeah.
inevitably is there on a concrete roof. And yeah, I think it's a very poetic project to green
Yes,
the roof of a war bunker, but it's also interesting what kind of plants over the last 10 years have settled there.
yes.
Unfortunately, it isn't too well maintained, so in a way, the the classical, so to say, the big five have established there, and the more specialized plants have actually been overgrown.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, yes, and of course, well, I mean, there was a time when Citroën in Paris was the sort of key Gilles Clément project, but that was quite a long time ago, and I'm sure has been superseded. Now you've shown a few pictures of Nantes, and you live near the city, and Nantes does sound a really rather wonderful place horticulturally. So could you tell us about Nantes?
Hmm. Yes, I actually, for the first time, went there 3, 4 years ago to a conference with Cassian and Bettina. And I remember leaving Nantes after a couple of days and thinking, oh, I think I could live here. And back then, I didn't yet know that I would live 10 minutes away a couple of years down the road. But partly the reason why I moved here is the incredible dynamism in the region of the Loire around plants and landscape. And yeah, what's fantastic in Nantes is that the city has really become a driver for innovative parks and gardens, and they're not shying away from making crazy experiments.
Mm,
The former director of the Green Space Direction once said to me, one can only understand Nantes if you understand that it's actually the birth city of Jules Verne. Jules Verne
mm, mm,
put
mm.
in 80 days around the world.
Yes.
And there is something that is both like, yeah, very green, but also steampunk about Nantes. For example, there are huge, giant, mechanic animals like elephants.
Yes, and I think that is probably what you say Nantes to a lot of people outside France. That's probably what they think of, the elephant and the little girl, these
Yeah.
enormous moving sculptures, as you say, straight out of the Jules Verne imagination.
But also, for example, there will be also photos in the Louvre, the Jardin Extraordinaire,
Mm.
which is a former stone quarry
Yeah.
that was turned into a public park. And because of the height difference of the quarry, they kind of installed a water fountain, which is like 80 meters high and has a
Yes.
closed water cycle.
Mm.
Uh, Continuously renewed in the groundwater. And because the quarry is so close to the Loire and kind of has this U shape, it is a microclimate, which is
Yeah.
4 degrees warmer than the rest of the city. And since Nantes is already in a very temperate climate, in this
Mm.
quarry, it's just like an incredibly subtropical vegetation.
Wow.
And you
Yes.
have like hedychiums and banana trees and gunera and tetrapanax and yeah, it's quite a fantastic park.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And some pictures coming up of a recent planting project at Chaumont.
Yes. Also in the Loire, together
Yeah.
with Kassian Schmidt and Bettina Jaugstetter.
Mm.
We were working on a project called Le Tourbillon de la Succession. So to say, the whirlwind of succession.
Mm.
And we basically got inspired by the dynamics of the Loire landscape, which at times has very dynamic alluvial landscape that both has very dry habitats on the sand dunes that appear in the middle of the river, and then very rich, organic, and moist milieus in which completely different plant communities thrive. So in a way, it's an alluvial landscape that is marked by extremes, and
Mm.
our design retakes these two extremes, working with two or actually three different plant mixes, two very drought resistant and one thriving in flooded environments.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Um, in our discussion we had, I think about a week ago, I made some not terribly serious reference to the sort of gap in understanding and comprehension between what goes on in France, in the garden and landscape world, and what happens in the rest of Europe. And you took it a stage further and said, "Oh, yes, France is an island," making out that garden and landscape in France is actually very self-contained.
Mm.
Could you say a bit more about that? Because I found that quite intriguing that you came up with that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see. I mean, of course, one would always say like England is the island of Europe, but in a way, France is the language island of Europe. And for
Mm.
example, in this recent collaboration with Bettina and Cassian, um, I think we met many of the things that isolate France a little bit. On the one hand, many collaborators really don't speak English or don't speak well enough or don't understand it well enough, which is why, for example, there are not so many learning resources for young practitioners to inform
Mm.
themselves and to teach themselves about planting design. Things that are very accessible in the UK and the US. People in Germany and in Belgium and in the Netherlands speak English very well. In France, for example, Garden Masterclass is not so known. I
Mm.
think simply because of the language barrier. And then I also, I'm saying that with a bit of irony, but France also has a very, how to say, formal culture, which I think with many codes and ways of respecting hierarchies and ways of working. Let's say it like this. And I think that also sometimes isolates France from England, which is, for example, much
Oh,
more easygoing or
yes,
experimental. And in
yes.
France, you always need to live through the whole three centuries of history before proposing a small little move.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So, oh, okay. So there has to be a very thorough explication of exploration of history and background before anything new can be proposed.
Yeah, and of theory, of yeah, definitely. But then there are exceptions. So I feel like it's also good to
Mm.
break what I'm saying and to look
Yes.
over to Nantes and to see that the former director of the green space management, Jacques Soignon, has created a city or has helped the city become an innovation hub for green space design. So in a way, there's always the exception, and there's also a lot of creative projects going on in France. Yeah.
Mhm. So, how do you see your career developing?
That's a good question. Maybe you can help me think about that because I often feel so busy at the moment that I do not have time to think about that anymore. Actually, after my PhD, I've handed in October, and then in February I defended it. And in October, I was kind of looking forward to having a bit of off time, and within a week, my agenda for a month got filled up.
Mhm.
And I feel like ever since, I've just worked in diverse design projects. I started to work with Baxac, a design company in Paris. I did this project in Chaumont-sur-Loire with Bettina and Cassian. I worked with the Institut du Monde Arabe, also in Paris, on a courtyard design. I did this project in the Aubrac that I just told you about, where we did a
Yeah, yeah.
roundabout and a public garden. And somehow, like after the PhD, which is a very, let's say, strategic piece of work, I've just
Mm.
completely embraced the more practical design work, and I feel like I still need to see how I'm going to bring together my research work, which I've yeah, also cultivated for many years now, and this more practical side. But in a way, it just did me enormously well to do hands-on work and to be outside a lot and to plant and to work with people. So I kind of embraced that very practical period for a while. And yeah, indeed, like it was beautiful projects that came along my way.
Mm, mm, mm. And I would imagine you probably look forward to having your own garden.
Ah, I would love to. I have a six square meter large or small balcony, and my partner always complains that he doesn't have space on it anymore because it's too densely planted. Yes, I would love to have my own garden, but maybe you come back to, I mean, to come back to your question of how I see things developing, next to having an own garden, I would really like to have a work life in which I could do half teaching and research and half practice design work. I think
Mm,
it's so important that we have people to bridge these universes that are neither kind of disappearing into universities nor
mm.
are having a lot of skills as designers but no time to actually teach. So I would
Yes.
really love to have such a hybrid position that is both practical but also looks into practice-based research and teaching.
Mm, mm.
Anybody has a position out there that is exactly that with a garden, you can write me.
When I had finished my PhD, there was that feeling that, oh, I wish I'd knew that before I started. And perhaps a PhD should be a sort of a two-stage process. You do a PhD and then and then you do another one. That second one being with the questions you really should have asked in the first place.
Yes.
What if you were to do a second PhD? What would you do? Which is another way of asking, what would you think might be some key research questions?
Yeah, let me think about that for a second. Um, well, it's exactly like you say. In a way, I feel like I mean my PhD was 3.5 years, which is long and short at the same time. But I feel like I only really understood my research at the very end. When it all came together. Um, and so in the very end, I was working on the edge of disturbance ecology, looking at
Mhm,
how do plant communities and landscapes respond to disturbances, and how can
mhm,
that help us inform design decisions and maintenance
mhm,
regimes and maintenance education.
mhm.
And I think if I would do it again, I would go straight into this niche in a way between
Yeah,
disturbance
yeah,
ecology and design and management.
yes.
I would do more, I would immediately do experiments with green space agents. I feel like I'm doing that now after my PhD as part of my design practice and as part of my work. But if I could have another year or another go, I would set up a collaboration with a town and work with them on this, yeah, exactly on this niche.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, a couple of comments coming in. Kate, uh, so lovely to hear you bringing interactions and reactions of people into the world of dynamic stroke naturalistic planting. I am taking away the phrase, what if biodiversity isn't enough?
Hmm.
Which is another way of saying what I think is James Hitchmore, who says, people are part of the ecology too. And then Anya, a great talk, Anna-Lena, but are sandy habitats in the middle of rivers or by the coast really dry? Doesn't vegetation survive as the water is very close and it reaches plants via capillary power in the sand? Could this habitat template idea be a common misconception?
No, actually, I mean, I don't have a photo right now to show, but we actually went back a couple of weeks ago to the planting, and I
Mm,
think the one could see a dynamic that also happens in rivers, namely that capillarity travels up, of course, the sandy dunes, but it doesn't reach all the sandy dunes. So in a way, it's a gradient. I think maybe I explained it a bit too extreme. I didn't mean that like the moment the substrate changes, it's completely dry, but it's a gradient that comes from moisture to drought, but in a way, the further you get away from the water edge or the higher you go up, the less
mm,
water travels. And also then, for example, the sandy substrates, they dry out
mm,
much, much, much quicker with sand. So in a way, that is a huge, if we think in stress, in terms of stress, this is a hugely stressful environment because there's less nutrients available and also less moisture available. I'm
mm,
wondering
mm.
if you want to add something, Bettina.
Bettina, you need to unmute.
Yes, I think it's in Germany they are even called brennen. That means burning, because the capillarity is not working that much, because in the underground are the bigger rocks, and so there is in the rivers is not so much capillarity actually. They are even quite dry, and so it's not okay, you can say, as you write, the humidity of the river gives humidity because in the air, that's right, and sometimes it's more flooding. So, and actually it's not drying out so fast. Once it is wet, the sand, we noticed that, Annalena, that on the
That's
top
true.
it's like a crust, and underneath it stayed quite humid in the sand. It's somehow not so dry as you might think in a sandy soil. This is also what Peter Korn and Till noticed when they work with planting in sand. Plants grow slowly at the beginning and more compact, but at the same time, the crust of the sand keeps the water inside as well. It's not drying out so fast.
But we also observed, for example, that the plants that were lower on the sand dunes were
Yes,
growing much faster already. Like even after 6 weeks, they were growing much
yes.
faster because they could
Then the
access
ones,
actually the water through the capillarity, whereas the ones that were on top
yes,
of the ridges were like
were the
much,
top.
much, much smaller and showing drought stress. So you can really see that there's a difference in access to water, especially now that they don't have deep roots yet. I mean, we hope that they will make deep roots.
Yes. And I mean, capillarity, it's drying out on the surface. We have a much bigger surface
Yeah.
on our ridges because they are quite steep than when you have a more flat island. So island, they are never so steep like we had them in our project.
Yeah,
In a
it's true.
river,
We obviously enhanced. I mean, in a way, we got inspired by the alluvial Loire landscape, but also by the ridge and swale dynamics, which you can find in North American prairies. And that's a very similar, it's a very similar dynamic in a way.
yeah, it's all these micro habits. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so this growing in low fertility, very free draining substrates is very much the zeitgeist. I mean, you mentioned Peter Korn, and I was mentioning earlier John Little, but there's the issue that in many situations, many urban public parks, for instance, we have the opposite situation. We've got moisture retaining, really fertile soils, and there is no option of working with a low fertility substrate. Perhaps we're missing a trick here that really perhaps should be a new focus. You know, how we manage in very intense competition in highly productive environments.
Yeah, I actually am glad you say that, Noel, because one of the things that I'm now meeting in many of the design projects is that, yeah, except from when you're working on a roundabout or on a roof where you can just take an engineered substrate, which often is also quite either heavy or expensive, you could choose. In many situations, you just have to deal with much richer soil. And I think it's really interesting to think like, yeah, how can we not bring tons of gravel and sand as our only strategy to deal with that, but actually rather to choose plants, so highly competitive plants that actually work with the already existing soil. So I feel like there's also something of yeah, of working with precious topsoil. And not every project, I mean, it depends on the context, but not every project can begin by taking away cubic meters and cubic meters and cubic
Exactly.
meters of soil just to have an engineered substrate. I mean, that's just unrealistic for many contexts.
And very often unsustainable. I mean, just sort of thinking back to the 1990s, when both in Britain and Germany there was a lot of interest in North American prairie flora, precisely because these were plants of very productive in environments, and that therefore could outcompete weeds, particularly weedy grasses in European environments.
Yeah.
And I sort of kind of just thinking recently, you know, all of that interest in prairie, it seemed to have stalled. I mean, I'm not hearing about many new prairies, and I'm seeing some of the established prairies developing various problems as they age. Do you think that prairie movement got stalled? Is it time to revisit it, perhaps?
Well, I mean, for example, in my case, for example, I went to the States not so long ago to the Midwest, and I
Yeah.
worked with Joan Nassar around native prairie plants, and I found that very interesting. But then I come back to France and I'm meeting laws and regulations which basically forbid to use non-native plants. And I feel like there is at the moment a huge movement of, I mean, government decisions to foster native plants. And it's difficult in that to work with exclusively non-native plants because either you do that, but you might not even get the project. You only get the project if you comply with these laws. And I think it's actually much more important to have more nuanced ways of seeing
Yes.
biodiversity than to say, I mean, it's funny, but like here in France, you really get Excel lists with what is considered a native plant in that region, with like the year that it was first cataloged, and then you can only use these plants.
Well, that's incredibly restrictive, and of course, just it goes against entirely what you were saying earlier about the need to. Gilles Clément wanting to work with novel ecosystems, climate change. I mean, completely bonkers. It is a sort of stranglehold that dogmatic ecologists have got over the regulatory process. I mean, we have it in Britain with the with biodiversity net gain. I mean, this you get extra points if you use lots of natives, and not so many points if you use wildlife friendly species that don't happen to be natives. It's a very depressing development, I think.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing then I think one was something I understood in my PhD is that the realm of ecology is easily a realm of ideology, of very polarized thinking, of
Yes.
like trying to find an easy rule that helps solve a problem. So there's biodiversity loss. Okay, then only native plants because they're good for pollinators, and then we're going to solve biodiversity loss. And I feel like this very quick jump to trying to make a rule or establish a law to solve a problem that we encounter and that we feel overwhelmed by, that's a very bad move. I feel like it's rather to skill people to make judgments in specific local contexts and to say what makes sense here. But obviously, that's much more difficult than to impose a law.
Yeah. Yes. So to end up with, just thinking about what if you were to do some traveling in the next couple of years, where in the world would you like to go to look at a habitat that you would love to, A, you would love to see, and B, could be a real learning experience, a real reference model for what might work in Western Europe?
What a lovely question. Well, I have two things in mind. I'm not sure how much they're relevant for Europe. The first place that came to mind, and I've actually recently been there, is the Amazon in Brazil. I've been there last autumn, and I feel like my mind still travels back there a lot. And
Yes.
what I found totally fascinating is that this forest grows on nearly exclusively sandy or silica soils. It's quite
Yes.
incredible because you can actually see so when the water level comes down a little bit in the Rio Negro, the soil is basically exposed. So you can see like a transact of the soil and the roots coming out of it. And it's incredibly poor soil, but there's this wonderful forest growing on it, and found it very interesting to see what kind of like strategies plants develop to live in this extreme habitat. And for example, trees often make roots that are on the surface of the soil or that are traveling upwards to capture the nutrients before they actually go into the sandy soil and wash out through all the rainfall. So when you're walking in the forest, it's actually a carpet of roots that you're walking on that is destined at capturing any decaying leaf as soon as it
Yes.
touches the ground, because then
Yes.
so quickly through rain it will get swamped into the river, and that's why the Rio Negro, the Black River, is actually black because all the leaf decay is in the river and not in the soil.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, so that was something that fascinated me, and I would love to go back there because I was obviously much too overwhelmed by all the novelty to understand enough of that forest ecosystem. And then the second place that I would love to travel to and learn with is the Mediterranean around Antalya, where my dad lives and where part of my
All
family
right. in Turkey. Yeah.
Yeah, which is an incredible place to see geophytes, orchids, tulips, but yeah, there's also very interesting Mediterranean flora, and maybe that would be more a trip that is interesting to think about urban green space plantings, because I mean,
Yes.
Turkey has incredible droughts ever since. I mean, what is a drought in Turkey now is unimaginable for us. I mean, there are sometimes cars just starting to burn in the street because it's so hot. And yet there are incredibly fascinating plant communities thriving on the coastal region between the mountains and the sea.
Yes.
So I would go there, I think.
Yeah. Good, great. Well, hopefully that'll be a possibility for you. So thank you very much, Anna-Lena. That was a really interesting discussion, and very much looking forward to seeing and hearing about what you come up with, and perhaps perhaps at some point we can do a webinar with you.
With pleasure. Thank you, Noel. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the lovely chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.